This is a legacy episode of the Lesbian Historic Motif podcast, originally released as part of the Lesbian Talk Show podcast group. Some references may be obsolete. The show looks at lesbian-relevant themes in history and literature, has interviews and discussions about current historical fiction with queer female characters, including fantastic versions of the past, and presents new original historical fiction for your enjoyment. Today, the Lesbian Historic Motif Project is delighted to be talking to Luci Dreamer, whose novel Heart of Gold just came out in April. Welcome, Luci.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So let's start by talking a little about your book. Heart of Gold takes place during the Klondike Gold Rush, so roughly at the end of the 19th century. The basic plot is one we see regularly for Wild West settings in that era. So one woman who is living as a man in order to have more social and economic freedom, and another woman who finds herself unexpectedly alone on the frontier, and they find each other. So you indicated that this is the start of a series. Why don't you tell the listeners a bit about your vision for this story and the ones to follow?
All right. So yes, the first one starts in the Klondike during the Gold Rush and actually ends as they are embarking on a new adventure. And then Heart Sings, the second in the trilogy, they go to San Francisco, where Thomas, my main character, who is dressing as a man, his dream is to own a ranch in the West. And so the second sequel picks up there where they build their own house and live on the ranch. And then the third is, actually there's a bit of a time jump, and it takes place around 1915. And then it actually goes through World War I and ends into the 30s.
So this is following one couple through all this,
yes,
rather than being a series.
Yeah.
So you mentioned they go to San Francisco. Do you manage to get them there for the big quake, or?
I do not. Actually, they settle in Sacramento. Sorry. They do settle in Sacramento, in the Sacramento Valley, right when kind of like the big ranches are starting to fade away. You know, Thomas makes a go of it and, you know, does pretty well.
I only asked about the quake because there seems to be like an identifiable subgenre of lesbian historical romance that involves people being in San Francisco for the quake. So I was curious.
No, I didn't. I thought about putting that in. You know, I did. I essentially skipped that part and I drove them for him because I really wanted to touch upon. So Thomas and Rachel. Well, Rachel has a son, and you know they raise him together, and you know as a married couple, and a lot of the third, the final in the series is TJ is his name, decides that he wants to join up for World War I, and that's the big, you know, I wanted to explore that and what that meant for the family. So yeah, we skipped the quake. I know Jay's done that such justice. I couldn't, you know.
Yeah, and Kathleen Knowles did it, and there's a couple others. I mean, I actually have a tag for that in my database.
That's funny.
So the story doesn't actually start in the Klondike. It sounds like it starts with the characters and their backstories and how they ended up there. Why don't you give a little bit of background on that?
So, Thomasina, who was born in Montana, she was promised, or about to be promised, to marry her father's business partner, who already had children. He was a widower, and she panics. She cannot, she would rather die than marry this man, and so she strikes off on her own. And I don't spend a lot of time on her transformation, where she decides to dress as a man. I open the scene with her purchasing clothing, to become to become Thomas, essentially. And she works her way to the West Coast, and around the time that she's working on boats, she hears of the Klondike Gold Rush and says, this is the perfect opportunity for me to earn enough money to get her ranch. And so off she goes. And on the steamship up there to Seattle, she meets Rachel, who is incredibly seasick. And so she helps her, figure out a way to something she could do to her wrist, to alleviate that pain. And it works. And they keep running into each other on their way up to the Klondike. And then tragedy strikes, and that gets our two main characters together.
Yeah, because the second character, Rachel, right?
Yes.
That she's married at that point, and her husband wanted to go to the Klondike.
Yes. Yeah. So on Rachel's story, so she marries the boy who's been courting her since she was 15, 16. And he has a thirst for adventure. So they end up leaving their hometown, and they too start moving across the West. She's not, completely in love with this, with her husband, but, they have a common goal, which is to, share an adventure and travel. And they end up making their way to Seattle as well, where we instantly find that Roy is really not up for the challenge. He's very impulsive and very impatient, and makes some bad decisions that end up costing his life.
And conveniently for the plot, getting him off the stage.
100%. And, it's funny. I really did make him a real... he's an idiot. But, he served his purpose, and I tried to make it pretty dramatic. They were on the Yukon River and one of the big rapids.
So it's clear from the synopsis of the 3-book arc that Thomas is lifelong living as a man in society. Now, the lesbian fiction field in general has had something of an uneasy history around the trope of gender disguise in historical fiction with regard to transgender understandings of similar historic figures. How did you approach that aspect of it in terms of the character's self-identity and in terms of how modern readers would come to this story?
Honestly, I didn't give a ton of deep thought to it. I read Jay's Backwards to Oregon many years ago. So I've read it a couple of times actually, and just kind of, taking the idea of it happening out of necessity, first of all, in order for a woman to live how she wanted, there were very few options. And, for Thomas, she took the route of dressing as a man. I do cover a little early on that she knew she was different from the get-go. She knew that she desired women the way that men desired women.
Uh-huh.
But she was resolved to never be able to explore that, because obviously she had this, big secret.
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting is, when she meets Rachel, and, when Rachel finally gets past the fact that Thomas is a woman, I explore a little bit more how Rachel sees her as almost two people.
Uh-huh.
She's got her Thomas persona, but when they are alone, just them, she goes, oh, okay, I have my Thomasina. It's symbolized by the wrap that keeps her breasts down. It's like once that's off, she becomes Thomasina again.
Uh-huh. So did you research the history of figures that cross gender in that way in the West, or was this more coming out from your imagination?
There's a movie called The Ballad of Little Joe.
Uh-huh.
About Josephine. I can't remember her last name right now, but she was roughly based on a real person who actually did that. She did end up, I think, marrying a man, but she moved across, and she had a daughter as well that she dressed as a man and pretended that she was a man with a daughter, moving across the country. But that's I didn't do a whole lot of research. Most of the research went into Klondike, and I wanted to get that right. But as far as, Thomas, I wanted to go mostly from the very organic feeling, I guess. I don't know.
Uh-huh. So what led you to set the story in the Klondike? Do you have a personal connection with that area or with the history of the gold rush?
I find it fascinating to compare the two, the California gold rush versus this one, and, how much further and more treacherous the journey was to get there. And, the fact that you had to have a year's worth of supplies to even be admitted passage, I think is pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've always been interested in learning more about it, and that turned into a story.
So you mentioned in passing when we were just setting this up that the story started out life as a fanfic.
Hmm.
Would it be too much of a spoiler for the characters to reveal what that original property was?
It was from the Winona Earp fandom.
Ah, uh-huh.
Love, lots of rich characters there to
And
explore.
hence the sort of Wild West feel.
Yeah, yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
What's the attraction of writing in historic settings for you? I know you have another novel coming out that's contemporary. How do the two processes differ for you?
I love to research, so and I love history. So a lot of time I'll get like this idea. Like for instance, this one came to me. My son was reading a Jack London novel called The Wild. And I just started thinking, I'm like, well, Klondike. I'm like, yeah, I've always wanted to, look more into that. And I'm like, oh, wait, I can marry the two, write one of my favorite lesbian tropes and set it in the Klondike. Definitely the research aspect I enjoy, and, putting characters into perilous situations. And of course, Klondike was ripe for that.
Well, you've got yourself quite a program set up with the three book series, but are there any other settings that you would love to set a story in?
Oh, so many. I mean, to be honest, I have like 4 books finished that I'm just meeting out, and it's a mix of contemporary and historical. But World War II is one of my favorite genres to write in as well,
Uh-huh.
a historic time. So I'll probably do something with that. One of the topics that I was interested in exploring was in eastern Canada in the 1600s. French sent all their fur trappers and trackers over. They realized that they needed to populate eastern Canada, so they sent over 500, it's either 300 or 500 women to help populate eastern Canada territory. And even today, the population can trace back to these original 500 women that were
Uh-huh.
sent over, to populate. So I thought that would be an interesting topic to look at, and of course research some more.
Uh-huh. Yeah,
And
I seem to recall reading that a similar thing happened in New Orleans early on, where
okay.
a bunch of women, poor women, were given dowries and basic supplies and shipped over to New Orleans to be available as wives.
Hmm.
So it's an interesting part of colonial history.
Yeah, it's insane to think about that. And most of these women, uh, they were cast-offs essentially. Well, there were 2 parts. There were kind of cast-offs, women that people didn't want, but then there were also the higher class women who wanted to just have an adventure. Who had
Mhm.
tired of the French men, I guess, in France, and wanted a bit of adventure. And they got paid, so that was enticing as well.
One of the interesting cycles in history is the quote unquote surplus women issue that happens, especially after major wars. And there's a fascinating parallel cycle of feminism and looking for more women's rights when you have women who may not have marriage available to them, and then they still need to make a living. So
Hmm.
that's a it ties in very nicely with the history of women finding ways of living that are not the standard heterosexual marriage script.
Right. And imagine having that and then having it taken away.
So this is, I think, your first novel being published.
Yes. Yes.
What was that journey like for you? Have you wanted to be an author all your life? Did it just suddenly occur to you? Have you been writing fan fiction for a very long time?
Actually, yes, I have. I started out writing poetry around high school, kind of dabbled in that. And then, around, well, the Xena fan fiction craze, I was involved in that, of course. I think most lesbian fiction writers of a certain age have definitely either read or have written, right? But I started there, gosh, over 15 years
It's
ago,
been a long time.
right?
I was a fan of Xena when it was first coming out, and that is literally over a generation ago now.
I know. Yeah, it's just crazy. Yeah, around the time that came out, that's when I came out. So it was a revelation, watching that and then getting these ideas and then writing full stories about them and the alternative universe. And so I've been writing, off and on for the last 15, 20 years. And it was actually this, Heart of Gold, which was, a fan fiction. Somebody commented, this really should be published, and this should be available, more widely.
Uh-huh.
And so we started to email each other, and she said, you should, put this. This should be an original, fiction story. And so I took it offline and began writing, rewriting and adding to it. I did submit it to a couple of publishers. It did come back rejected, but it was a blessing in disguise. I found this awesome writing group. We nicknamed our group Dad Jobs, which was actually a typo from Day Jobs, but it stuck. And those women have been amazing. They have helped me tremendously. So I have to have a shout out to them.
What was it like to revise it from a fan fiction to a standalone novel? How much did you change?
Honestly, pretty much just the names. I mean, because it was 100% canon divergent. The only thing that I had to change were the names and a little bit of the character traits where you would like, oh, I know who that is. If you were to read both and compare them side by side. But, I did I researched for the fan fiction as well. So I just really had to, I added in like 20,000 words, just different scenes,
Uh-huh.
and then just changed the names, and there it was. I mean, it was pretty much an original fiction and in name. So yeah.
So the contemporary novel that you have coming out, I guess later this month, In the Black, did that also start as fan fiction, or is that purely original?
Purely original. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. That one I started writing back in probably November and set it aside when I decided to rewrite or revise Heart of Gold. And then I just picked it back up, and yeah. I did a little research for that too, for wildland firefighting. That was
Uh-huh.
pretty interesting.
Why don't you give a little blurb for it, since it's just about to come out, and even though it's not historical, this is your chance to promote.
Well, thank you. So yeah, so it's about a wildland firefighter from a small town. Her name is Michelle Mitchell, but she goes by Mitch. And she's made her way to firefighting captain. And her basically, she loves her dog, she loves her job, she loves her best friend. His name is Fish, and he's also a firefighter. But she always, in the back of her mind, thinks about her ex-girlfriend, her high school sweetheart, Lily. And then Lily shows up because her aunt is sick, and her aunt wills her the bar, and so she moves back to her small town from Atlanta, and they reconnect. Over their aunt, over Lily's aunt, because Mitch knew her very well as well, and feelings start to be rekindled, and they work their way back to each other.
As one does.
Yes, exactly. Happy ending all. But
Well, that's fabulous.
yeah.
So if listeners wanted to follow you on social media, where should they look?
So I am on Twitter quite a bit at LuciDreamer70. My website is lucydreamerwriter.com, and there you can subscribe to my newsletter I started, and you can email me comments, whatever. But those are my two main social media platforms I do. I don't do Facebook, sorry. Can't do it.
Okay. Well, I will include links to those and to the books we mentioned in the show notes. And thank you so much for joining us here on the Lesbian Historic Motif podcast.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Lesbian Historic Motif Podcast. See the show notes for links to people and topics. Most shows will have a transcript linked as well. If you have a book announcement, a topic suggestion, or might like to appear on the show, please drop me an email. If you enjoyed this podcast, please rate it and subscribe on your favorite podcast app, and consider supporting our Patreon.